You know, I want to take a look now at where we are today when it comes to perceptions of institutional racism. Professor Peter Hammer is the director of the Damon J. Keith Center for Justice at Wayne State University. Take a look.
We're at ground zero of structural racism or spatial racism in Southeast Michigan. And sometimes I say we're the new Selma. And if we don't recognize that, and if we don't rally to that and call things by their true names. So it's incredibly disturbing to me as people are talking about this renaissance of Detroit, this sort of restructuring of Detroit, the resurrection of Detroit. You look at the major documents that underlying that, going back to Detroit Future City, looking at the Blight Removal Task Force report, looking at the Bankruptcy Plan of Adjustment, those are completely acontextual. They are looking at the issues and challenges of Detroit economically in complete isolation from our history. Right? And anybody who knows anything says if you don't do a root cause analysis, and if you're not addressing the root causes, there's no chance to have a success. And then people sort of throw up their hands in their surprise that there's a tale of two cities emerging, that in 7.2 miles of the city where tremendous investment is going on, largely public subsidized, right? So it's Detroit dollars that are actually increasing the economic divides. And then you go out to the neighborhoods and you look at the state of the schools, and that's largely a failure of state policy, right? The problems in Detroit public schools are decades-long problems in the school finance formulas, compounded by the lifting of the sort of cap on charter schools, and you have had generations of Detroit children that are basically been written off through no fault of their own, right? Through a failure of state policy. So all of these things are coalescing in Detroit in ways that are more serious than probably any other part of the country.
You know, I think it's very interesting to hear him say that. And also, so we're talking about jobs here, we're talking about economic opportunity, we're also talking about education and housing, Keith. And what stuck out to you most of all in that conversation with him?
Well, I think what stuck most is once again in terms of housing, you know, in terms of the segregation that's there. When we're talking about the children that have been locked out, you know, I think that's the thing that jumps out at you because we're talking about an education system that has still failed. Of course, Chastity done a lot about that, but what that means for the future of the city, you know, in terms of when you're talking about the economic, the opportunities that are here, but will they be able to take advantage of those that are here? And are they sufficiently prepared for that? And that's what we need. I mean, we talk about a lot of research into the city, which is great. But when we're talking about we failed a generation of children who have not been given the tools that they need to succeed in the Detroit that's moving, you know, in a whole new direction. And a lot of the jobs that are coming are not there. That really holds some serious questions for us, for the future of the city. Yeah, Chastity, you've done a lot of reporting on education and taking a look at where we were 50 years ago and now in Detroit schools. And how do you compare?
What we see is, you know, schools are more segregated now, 50 years later, than they were in 1967. I mean, it's just bad. And in the inner ring suburbs, in the city, you have far more schools that are majority black and majority white.
And you have people that keep moving out by choice and,
yes,
and kind of perpetuating the cycle.
Since 1967, you had the the Bradley versus Milliken desegregation case where the U.S. Supreme Court basically made it easy to keep segregated schools in our region. And after that, you had school choice, which allowed people to stay where they were and exacerbate segregation as well. So the schools are more segregated, and you have an imbalance of resources going to schools. You have poorer, browner, blacker schools getting less resources, and that's why I say we're worse off now than we were in 1967 as far as education.
I mean, that's a stunning thing to hear, Nolan. How is that impacting where we are today?
Well, I mean, if we don't get education right, I think Chastity is right on. We're not going up, we've been going down over these past 50 years. We don't get education right, you're at risk of establishing a permanent underclass in this society, and that's not good for a lot of reasons, but it's also not good for the economy, just sheer economic reasons. That's a bad thing. And so we've got to get people trained to work. We have to provide opportunities for entrepreneurship across the board, for African Americans, for others. You've got to have full participation in the economy. I think economic empowerment solves a lot of ills.
Stephen.
So I think you got to pull the lens back a little bit and look at how we're doing this. Think of how we prioritize education in the city versus other things. Think of this week, for instance. How easy was it for the Pistons to get $35 million in subsidy to move downtown? How easy is it to fill a hole by contrast in the school budget? And I understand that there's laws and there's processes that set that up, but those are the things we need to be looking at. Why do we make it easier for a basketball team to get $34 million than for a school to have enough money to serve 3 meals a day, for instance, which you need to do in a lot of schools, or to keep the heat on in the winter. We're getting that wrong, and I think we got to start talking about it at that level.
That's why it's being challenged. I mean, that's extremely important, and I think that's why that's actually being challenged by a couple people now. I think which that challenge actually has some merit. I mean, in terms of, because that's what a lot of Detroiters are asking themselves. I mean, all the policy and everything else aside, I think your average Detroiter is wondering how in the world is all this being built so quickly, so fast, and when they want money, they can get it. But then we can't get it, and I think that people are worried about
Keith,
this.
what will the Pistons pay its first round draft pick today? Today's the draft. What will that contract be?
Yeah.
Just one would.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Right,
Half the
right.
school budget.
And yet, you know, we keep having these sport teams come up and saying, we need public dollars. And I don't care if it's the Pistons or the Tigers or whomever. If you can pay a shortstop who's, you know, batting
Mediocre.
220 and not
Right,
playing
right.
$25, $30 million a year, why do you need that out of the city budget?
A little bit of priority.
When you take a longer view, like Stephen was saying, you also have to say, if our schools are failing, what happens? What other dominoes fall? You have a joblessness rate, an unemployment rate that is worse in the city than it was 50 years ago. You have people who are black and brown not getting the opportunities that they were used to 50 years ago. Just, you know, a few years past Jim Crow, things are worse off as far as joblessness, housing, schools, all of that. And then you got a prison population. 7,000 people were in prison in 1967. Now we got 41,000, and most of those people are uneducated people who are black and brown, and very many from Detroit.
Yeah, the mass incarceration problem is definitely a big one. I want to end, Keith, with you with housing, and Chastity brought it up. Where are we today? And when we compare the availability of housing, the ease of being able to own your own home here in the city of Detroit?
Well, I think it's interesting because the way it's being promoted is that, you know, move to Detroit, get a cheap house. This is a great place to buy. The reality is not there. And when you're looking at the average, most homes are sold now. As I said before, there was a great piece done in Cranes where they had most homes being sold cash, about $30,000, very few being able to get mortgage. Most of the homes are underwater now, so people who want to sell their homes really can't do it, especially if they want to get a profit. People want to buy a house, can't get a loan to do it. So, I mean, it's a much more complex situation because the economy in Detroit is still shot. It's still not good. I mean, so that causes a number of problems, and just and that's for anybody. Even people with great credit are having problems with that. So you look at the average Detroiter who has very little money, poor, and also more people are renting now. You know, it used to be the place where most African Americans own their home.
That's no longer first time since the 50s, yeah.
Right. No, that's turned. So that's no longer the case. So it's a bad situation.
Well, we'll continue to watch what you both write in Michigan Chronicle and also in Bridge Magazine as we continue to do our project with the DJC. Keith Owens and Chastity Pratt-Dawsey, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Anytime.